welcome. My name is Megan Perry. You can call me Meg. And I'm a director of strategic partnerships at Learner-Centered Collaborative, and we're excited to be hosting this webinar on competency-based assessment and to have this conversation with our two guests, Jeff Petty and Nerel Winter, two experienced educators in innovative spaces. And I'm excited for a conversation about competency-based assessment in particular. That's the bulk of our time today. We'll be in conversation with each other. Before we wrap up, we'll have a chance to circle back to questions that you as the audience have. So if you've got them now, you're coming to the webinar with thoughts in your mind, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And if they come to you during the conversation, also add them there so that we can capture them. And we'll do our best to circle back before we close to address specific questions if you have any. I think that's it. We'll give a short introduction. Let me introduce myself. I know you're probably expecting Katie Martin, who is the LCC Director of Impact, who last minute got called away. And so I've been called in to step in for her today. I am excited to be here, and just to give a little bit about background about myself, in case I don't already know you, I am coming to LCC from a long career in education, working in innovative spaces as a classroom teacher, a school leader, a nonprofit leader, and having the good fortune to be able to work in spaces of innovation with a deep background in deeper learning and project-based learning, and most recently coming from being the director of Embark Education, where competency-based learning was a core focus of ours. So I'm excited to be in this conversation with these two great panelists, and I'm going to do our introductions in sort of two ways. Sort of the first question, the first minute or two of like, who are you? Give us the short version of your bio, a la what I just shared, and then we're going to circle back and dive a little bit deeper. And so, Jeff, I'm going to ask you to go first. If you would tell us, who are you?
Hey, super excited to be here. I'm Jeff Petty. I live in Seattle, and I currently work as a school leadership and innovation partner with Big Picture Learning, as a coach with Two Revolutions, and independently as School Foundry, helping folks design learning environments.
Great. Thank you for that. Nerel, give us your professional, who are you?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here. My name is Nerel Winter. I lead Bostonia Global. We are a TK through 14 in-district dependent charter that's part of Cajon Valley Union School District. We're part of San Diego. And we are thrilled to be here, and with such a really awesome group of innovators and thinkers around changing education.
Awesome. Okay, so probing a little bit deeper, Jeff, I'm going to kick it back to you. Who are you really? What is it? What is underneath that surface level bio that you just gave us that drives you in this work, particularly in spaces of innovation around competency-based learning and assessment?
Ooh, I think ultimately this is social justice work for me. I think if I weren't doing school-related work, I never really thought of myself as a school person, or I didn't come into this through a traditional teaching path. So I'm kind of ultimately in this for the impact that I think our school systems have on a functioning democracy and a just society. And then a level down from that, I think what really drives me is that learning is fun and people are born curious, and it's, I think, a really straightforward, organic process. And I think with our school systems, we have really cluttered and compromised it, sadly, in ways that that over time start to cause kids to feel like they're ineffective learners, or that their interests aren't valued in schools. So that's what really drives me, is trying to help us kind of get school out of the way of learning.
Love that. That resonates with me deeply. Thanks for sharing that. Nerel, how about you? What's underlying that professional version of bio for you that drives you in this work?
I think I'm a good product or a good example of the PTSD that we have of going through the traditional education system in the US, and just all the turmoil that our students have to go through. I went through high school. I did what everyone does and went to college, right? And I thought that that was the success metric for my life, and realized very quickly that just getting into college doesn't actually mean that you know who you want to be. And so floundering through what does that mean and who am I and who would I want to become and all these sort of aspects. And I think for us, the idea is we have to rethink education about being about academics solely, and rather about relationship networks, and really redesigning school to be around each one of our students and knowing them well, and being able to create school around who they want to be. And so a lot of my passion is drawn from my own experiences, and the reality that school, unfortunately, isn't about kids. It's about something that's way far off the mark, and we have to redesign around what that should be.
Yeah, I love that. That deeply resonates with me, just like a little bit. I'll like join in that what's behind it. That the idea of where I come from, my dad was a high school physics teacher. And as a student myself, you know, going through middle and high school, like I didn't understand at all. I very clearly remember having like this question of like, why would you want to teach physics for 20 years? Like it's the same thing over and over and over again, to your point around like it's not about students. In my mind, school was about like the physics, and it wasn't until I was in college that I had this realization of like, oh, it was never about the physics for him, like this lifelong career, right? It was about each and every learner. And that really shaped me as an educator. So thank you both for sharing that. Before we dive into questions, I'm just going to take a step back for a second and talk about a little bit about competency-based reporting and what competency-based assessment, competency-based learning even is, and how LCC comes to think about it and talk about it. And so, you know, we envision at LCC education ecosystem where learners know who they are, thrive in community, and actively engage in the world and as their best selves. And in order to do that, we think that requires a shift in what learning looks like, very much like both of you just talked about, that it should be equitable, inclusive, that it should be personalized, authentic, and what we're here to talk about today, competency-based. And so much of what that is about, for me personally, I definitely have my own experience and perspective around it. But that's really like shifting what we're oriented towards, right? Rather than grades and sorting and content, like both of you also talked about, it's around a shift towards whole learner outcomes and authentic uses of skills as opposed to discrete standards. Especially given where we know what we know of the world and what we don't yet know of the world in the future, helping learners navigate what that future will look like for themselves will be very different than even the way that we navigated it. So thinking about things like communication and critical thinking and collaboration, we're able to get at those in a much more rich and demonstrating their learning sort of way, as opposed to the way we do assessment and grades currently. So our hope today for this webinar is that we all get a chance to understand, sort of unpack a little bit what competency-based learning is about, and getting some examples of schools who have done it in different ways, but with high degree of success. And so you have those sort of proof points around like what is possible and what it is can work. And you know where schools are in their journey. So with that, giving a little bit of an intro into LCC and a little bit my personal sense of what competency-based learning is about. I would love to hear from each of you sort of this basic question of like, how do you define competency-based learning, assessment, reporting, and why does it matter to you? Nerel, why don't you kick us off?
I think the most foundational way to think through competency-based reporting is learning happens anytime, any place, anywhere. And I think if that's the value point that you're using, then you start rethinking around our metrics of time, our metrics of assessment, and ultimately, what is the reasoning behind how we're assessing, right? And so competency-based reporting is a focus around allowing students to show that they're smart in many ways, allowing them to demonstrate their learning through many different modalities, and then us as a school system allowing learning to happen outside of the school walls. And so being capable of shifting with our students and capable of shifting with who they are. And so in the US today, we see three main types of learning strategies. There's standards-based approaches, there's mastery-based learning, and competency-based learning. And unfortunately, true competency-based systems are far and few between, because it's so much easier to stick into a mastery-based learning, and then which slides back into standards-based grading policies. And so to really be intentional about competency-based learning is to really be thoughtful around what are the outcomes that you're wanting for our students and what are the endpoints that we're looking for in terms of success.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And just what you're saying, like, can you, like, I always like to dig a little bit deeper underneath, like, what is it about that is the why, right? Like the why for you around the redefining outcomes and the changing of opportunities. I would just love to hear you, like, from your experience or your experience with your students at Bostonia, like, what are you seeing? What are you seeing as the bigger picture there?
There are so many limitations to allowing students to be successful, and those parameters are typically set by our state that we live in, by the university systems that we work with, by all of the different you can't do this because, right? And so there's so much fear that revolves around what do we do about grading, how do we do assessment, all of these different components. And so I think for me, the challenge is how do we create a system that truly revolves around each one of our students? And how do we allow the system to know the students really well and to be exceptional in pulling all of the different attributes of our students out to the forefront and allow that to be sort of the characteristic that defines how we do assessment. And that's really exciting, because what that means then is, we all, I'm assuming, went to high school, likely in the US, right? And so Jeff, you went to a high school and I went to a high school. We both likely took Algebra 1, right? And we both likely got, let's say, a B. The B that you received in Algebra 1 in your high school and the B that I received in my high school, did we learn the same things? Likely not. Did our teachers have the same styles? Probably not, right? And so yet we're stuck and refrained in these grading systems that attribute a letter grade to demonstrate this is who our kid is for life. And we have so many students that have so much more potential. And I'm at school, so you can see there's
got the bells.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I really love the way that you like called out the fullness, right? Like, and you're giving your Algebra 1 example, and like, and I did not get a B in Algebra 1, let me just say. And so like how that can really shape and define who you are as a learner, but like acknowledging the richness, right? And really leaning into the richness that is what's going to take for like a student to know themselves well and know their strengths and what they need to work on is like invaluable in moving forward in the future. Jeff, I would love to hear from you around either like sort of responding to Nerel or your own question around like what does competency-based learning assessment reporting mean to you and why does it matter?
I sometimes worry that I might say too much about what I think about competency-based learning and get kicked out of the competency-based club. I don't know if I'm in the club, but I really resonate with what Nerel said about each individual learner. And I think my entry point to competency-based is it seems like the best available space within which to do interest-driven learning. Mm-hmm. And a worry I had, well, to back up a little bit, I think what happens when really powerful learning is happening is that we're driven by our interests and we set out to pursue those interests. We set out to do work that we really care about. I don't know anyone as an adult who starts their day really motivated to address a competency. But in the course of doing meaningful work, we grow and learn and improve in all sorts of skills that then we could turn around and especially with help, articulate how we grew in various competencies. And so to me, it enables us to do interest-driven learning and then have a system of talking about and reporting about the skills that were developed by individual students pursuing very unique interests. And also, as Nerel pointed out, in all sorts of contexts. Maybe the learning was at school, maybe it was at an internship, maybe it was at home, could have been wherever. And I also, a current sort of worry I have is around the portrait of a graduate work. I feel like what most of us really hope for kids is that they learn how to learn and that they develop agency for themselves and to kind of translate their like desires, wants, hopes for the future into some meaningful action. And a lot of, I think when we do portraits of a graduate, that kind of work, because we're all in our school heads, there's a tendency for those lists of competencies to grow and grow and resemble more things that might be aligned with a 6-period school day or a lot of the traditional structures. And I think when we use a competency-based approach, it can help us really focus in on, we want to assess whether your interests are driving your learning. We want to assess whether you're growing as a learner. And along the way, talk about competencies, but not have the competencies be the driver in the roadmap in the way that they, I think, have been in like a standards-based system.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I mean, I think my sort of bias in coming to competency-based learning is exactly the same from a project-based learning background around like what's the real question that is a problem in the world that we want to try to solve and figure out. And so it's through that, like what are the questions that we're trying to answer, and so what are the skills that we need in order to be able to answer that question. So I that very much resonates with me, and I come. You know, if we were going to rank those things, authenticity almost comes first, but then and authenticity, interest, as you said it, but then it's like, okay, and the things that we're going to work on and the skills that apply whatever question we're trying to answer, like let's define what those skills are, and work on advancing our practice in those skills in any different discipline, in any different question. So that really hits home for me really very deeply. I would love to hear, like in that context, thinking about like what are ways, like how are we using that approach to help learners show what they are learning and like know what they can do? Like how does that, being able to, Nerel, you gave this nod to like, we have these systems and structures and we're in these state, like state mandates and district mandates around like how we report things. And that can be sort of like the driver. I think, Jeff, that's what you were getting out of like, we fall back into too easily, like, what are the requirements versus like of schooling versus what are the attributes of learning. And so what does that look like for you in the schools that you're in, Nerel and Jeff, that you've led, around how are students showing their learning, and what does reporting look like? Nerel, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think just to add to what Jeff was saying, though, first, I completely agree with you, Jeff. And the reality is, if you're designing a portrait of a graduate, the trouble is we tend to see that as a stagnant endpoint that we're looking for students to hit. And competency-based learning is never stagnant, because the whole intent of it is that competencies shift over time. What we're looking for, those skills, will be different between generations, right? And some may stay the same, but it's also dependent on where are the endpoints that students require for success in life. So for Bostonia Global, we are a in-district charter that's part of Cajon Valley. We were a TK8. We then redesigned high school because our family said, hey, high school is not working. That's a nice way to put it. And it's completely focused on just getting kids into college, and perhaps we want to shift things up a bit. And so the slide deck here is just going to give you a quick overview of it, but we have 3 main design elements that are revolving around Bostonia Global. The first of this is around this idea of advisory. Advisory, unfortunately, is a overused term similar to competencies in the US today, where it's tends to become homework club, like it's an hour time frame in the mornings where homework is done, and that's not what we're about. We're an advisory-based system where every single human is around relationships, and that's our entire focus, is how do we build relationships, how do we know students really well. The second component for us is this idea of strong positive impact within a global community. And we have to shift the mindset about school being centered around school, and rather school is centered around the networks that students are able to bridge with the world around them. And the last piece here is where, Megan, I'll dive into, and this is rather complicated in the state of California, is this idea of an individualized pathway for every scholar. To build a high school in California, you're looking at a couple of really difficult limitations, and those unfortunately are not so much created by the state, but they're created by our UC system, the University of California system, and they're called what are A3G requirements. And so there's a tremendous amount of fear revolving around high schools in California around what are we going to do to ensure that our students are A3G ready, which allows them to get into the University of California system. And so for us, while we were developing the high school, one of the things that we noticed was we had to shift away from standards-based learning, where learning is a moment of time, and move beyond mastery-based learning, which is really a small subset of skills, and start developing out a competency-based framework where we can start allowing students to demonstrate their learning through many different modalities, especially as we develop school around them. And if you don't mind shifting to the next slide, then I can jump into what that looks like. And so we started working through this idea of, in California, or in San Diego rather, we have a rather difficult statistic, which is that between the ages of 16 and 24, about 10% of our total student body or student population, about 440,000 students, are not working or not in school. And so we had a lot of conversations with our surrounding careers, surrounding industries, surrounding 2 and 4 institutions around, well, what is it that we need to shift in terms of education? And what are those competencies, those endpoints that we're looking for to support students in terms of where they need to go? And so it broke down into the final endpoint being achieving gainful employment, or having the ability to really be a sense of happiness and purpose in what you do, but then breaking it down to 4 subsections, which are being curious and investing in the world, thinking deeply, realizing future self, and expressing ideas. And so as we were building out our system, we looked at models across the US. Big Picture was one of those. I saw Julia Bamba was in this. Gibson Eck was one of the schools that we partnered with closely. And we're looking into what is it ultimately that we need within San Diego to really start to develop a pure competency-based model, which is able to support students. And so these are sort of our endpoints. As we mentioned earlier, this is not stagnant. These will shift as industry and as our partners tell us these are things that need to happen. And so we wanted to really be thoughtful about what was it that we were assessing, what was it that ultimately we're looking for, and how do we ensure that we hit all of our A3G requirements, that we support students in being able to be competitive for university if that's something that they choose to do, but where the endpoint isn't going to university, the endpoint is a successful career where they feel like they're gainfully employed. And so for us then, that was what we surround ourselves with. And if you don't mind going to the next slide. Then that's created what's called basically our student journey, which is a deep and rich journey in terms of the idea that learning never is a moment in time, right? And I think the biggest way I present this is in many standards-based approaches, you take a test, you receive a grade, and that grade is what you receive for your class. And unfortunately, most grades are based on a 0 to 100 based system, where the majority of the numbers or the points are from 0 to 50. So rather, right from the start, you're failing. And your chance of failing is rather high, right? And so for us, then it becomes, what does it look like to provide very deep learning in a way that's really designed around intentional learning, that is project-based, that's design-based, that's understanding who our students are, but also driven with feedback and self-assessment and iteration, and where we have portfolios of learning that ends in these capstones where students can express who they are. And then finally, if you can go to the next slide, then it becomes about how do we target the conversation around universities? And this will be likely another conversation on its own. But we had our first graduating class last year, and we sent students off to universities across the US, major universities, with a 0.00 GPA, with a pure competency-based framework with a growth transcript that looks similar to what you see here on the screen, where what we're demonstrating to universities is that the endpoint is we want to really be thoughtful about who our students are beyond just the academic skills that they receive in high school. We also want to be thoughtful about what are all of the other competencies that students need to demonstrate to be successful in their future selves, and that is dependent on where industry is taking it. So in a nutshell, right, if you are truly wanting to create a system that revolves around every single student, we have found that competencies, and really competency is another way of saying knowing students based on who they are and allowing them to express themselves in many different ways, like that's the idea. That's the only way to approach this. And then you have to develop the entire school system around that, which, let me tell you, if you want to learn how to do that in California, there's many loopholes and many ways to play with it, even within public education. And that's where we are in our sort of our environment that we play with.
Yeah, I love the point there of like, it's sort of saying like the idea of loopholes. It's like, what are the real constraints? What are the perceived constraints to do things? And what are the real constraints that are actually there, right? When we have sort of the weight of and the history of the system sort of like in us, having come through it, like what is actually possible is much broader than we really are aware of. I really appreciate you talking us through that and being able to see an example of like what kinds of competencies you're focused on at Bostonia Global, and like congratulations on your first graduating class, and being, you know, the one of my frustrations is like it's not even like the state system. It's like multiple competing inputs that feel like they limit our ability to do this work. Is there's like, what are the state requirements, and then there is this higher ed like gorilla in the room that that people feel like we can't push back against. And so I love that you're showing like 0.0 GPA, but like here's who this learner is. So congratulations on that. That's really exciting. Jeff, I want to give you a chance to jump in here and like sort of respond, react, but also thinking about it. One of the things that I think what you're showing in what you've shared here, Nerel, is this idea of like how rigorous, you know, there's this idea of like, well, if we don't have these standards, and if we're not talking about courses and people aren't earning grades, that's not rigorous academics. And so what does that, you've sort of given us an example of like this idea of what that can look like and what it can really be grounded in. But I would love to hear, Jeff, your take on, you know, responding to what Nerel just shared, but also this idea of like the view that like project-based and competency-based is fluffy as opposed to like really rigorous learning, and how you've experienced that, and yeah, and examples of how it's been, how you've seen it and experienced it and led it being rigorous.
Oh, that's such a huge topic, the rigor one. Thinking about the PTSD of traditional schooling, I think my own high school experience on paper looked really rigorous. I mean, I just killed it in terms of GPA. And then I got to college and realized that my actual understanding of a lot of those topics was really flimsy, because I had become really skilled at doing what I thought the adults wanted me to do, and essentially doing school. So I think that's also a really important piece for people undertaking this work, is to hold fast to your trust that what you're doing is rigorous, and that building a community assessment process around work that kids really care about, especially when it's occurring in different contexts with community-based mentors, is super rigorous. And pushing back against the idea that a single adult who sees 120 to 150 kids a week and is operating on a gradebook system is some version of rigor. It also makes me think of Larry Rosenstock. There's a great film, one of the co-founders of High Tech High, where he introduces a notion of rigor that, I'm going to paraphrase this, but it's adults engaging in work that they're passionate about, and then bringing students alongside them to kind of join in that interest and join in that work. But also another thing Nerel addressed was the challenge of doing this against all the constraints. And that made me think of, again, if you're undertaking this work, a couple of pieces of advice. One, find other people who have done this or are doing this to remind you that it's possible. And then a big learning from us in the early years of Highline Big Picture was don't ask up. And by that I mean we would ask our district office if we could do a certain thing. And they were supportive. They would say, well, like, gosh, that's never come up. I don't know. Let me ask the educational service district. And so you had a compliance-oriented organization asking a more compliance-oriented organization, hey, can we do this thing? And they would say, wow, that's never come up. I don't know, probably not. But let's ask the state superintendent's office. And so we would be paralyzed waiting for an answer. And we quickly learned that we needed to look directly to state statute to figure out like what actually is against the rules and what's not. And to your point, Meg, we realized that there's a huge breathing room for innovation often in these spaces where, because of the way things have been done, there's just this sense that it can't happen that way.
Yeah, that resonates really deeply with me. I spent a number of years at Embark Education, and even coming from a project-based deeper learning background as an educator and leader, there was still moments of like, oh, we can like I had my own unlearning. Like, look, we need to do X. Someone would say, why do we need to do we need to do X? Like, let's find out. Like, do we really need to do that? Or is that our own sort of like institutionalized sense of like what should happen?
Yeah.
Um,
I think that I want to shout out also Juliet, who's here with a couple of students. For me, the best way to unlearn has been to collaborate with students in the design process. And in the design process for Gibson Eck, we involved students in that. And I was carrying my understanding of big picture learning into that process. So I had my understanding of advisory, and students completely blew that up, and said, well, wait a minute, advisory isn't like just this room and these colleagues and this person. Advisory is about 5 different things. And why does this one need to happen in this space with that adult? That should be able to happen anywhere in the building. So a great way to unlearn is partner with kids in the design process.
yeah, yes, absolutely.
But I'd love to share a little bit about, which we could do off the deck, about how that assessment, competency-based assessment, works in the big picture space. And in my experience, schools can go about this in a lot of different ways. So I tried to shy away from sharing like this is a template at a school and be more in the idea space. But this first slide just presents this idea that on the left, we have a super unique individual kid who has interests, passions, past experience. Depending on their age, they might have post-high school ambitions. They have strengths, growth areas, and motivations. And all that sort of goes into this thing that we call the learning plan. And then the learning plan is constantly iterated as the student is learning in real world settings, school-based learning, and then things that they're doing in their life outside school. And then all that is compiled into a portfolio that's presented at an exhibition. And next slide. Thank you. I mentioned this in a LinkedIn post, like all the learning plan templates we had seen, none of them worked when we tried to plan our own work with them. I shout out to a colleague, Dan Dundon, who said, if we're trying to get kids to use a learning plan, maybe we should use them. And all of the versions we had competencies or standards embedded. And I was principaling at the time. I was like, I can't plan my week around what competencies I'm trying to address. I noticed I have a lot of projects. So we adapted the work of David Allen and GTD and developed a really simplified learning plan that was just 3/3 of a piece of paper. And we asked kids like, why are you here? What do you care about? If you could envision an amazing school year, let's describe what that looked like. Kids had never had anyone talk to them like this at school. So another thing I think it's really important to emphasize, to Nerel's point, is that if you're trying to create this kind of culture, this demands a lot of structural changes in your school day and the roles of adults. Otherwise, students are just going to look at you like, I don't know what these people are talking about. My interests are mine. It's got nothing to do with school. Just going to get through the period. Anyway, so we developed these learning plans. Next slide. And then at the other end of the cycle, and this was a bunch of years of learning at a particular school and also learning from the iterations of schools like Gibson Eck, the student initiates the exhibition, and then the exhibition is scheduled so that the time allowed to talk about the learning is, I would say, at least as large, if not larger, than the kid's presentation of the learning. And then the student self-assesses first, and then the advisor sort of facilitates a conversation among the other people present about the quality of the work and what it means. And if you go to the next slide, and I think Ashley's going to drop a link in the chat to this feedback form. And then the slide after that, just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So this is an exhibition. The guy standing up is the advisor, and the student is out of the picture at the far left. They've just finished presenting, and parents are there, peers are there. The advisor follows this student multiple years and is with them pretty much all day, every day. And then additional adult staff members are there. And what's happening is if you look on the whiteboard, you can see there's some marks. And if you go to the next slide, this is what it looks like at the end. So the advisor is facilitating a conversation in which the student says, well, I think my learning progress or my learning plan this time there was significant progress. And here's why. And then other students in the room are weighing in, mom and dad are weighing in, everyone else is weighing in to kind of come to a consensus determined assessment of, we think the student's learning plan shows significant progress. And then we talk about new learning, and then the quality of projects and the quality of the internship experience. And part of what I think this is accomplishing, or what it's trying to accomplish, is in contrast to what might be a long list of competencies, we're saying what we really value is that the student is driving their learning. And so let's make the assessment about that. And if you look at that feedback form sometime later, you'll notice that it also includes a place for panelists to, as the student is sharing about their work, make notes about, oh, I think I'm seeing some empirical reasoning growth here, or, oh, I'm not really seeing enough growth in quantitative reasoning. I want to note that and push for that in the next learning cycle. So this is the balance that I think is really difficult to create, where it is about the competencies and you need to sort of push and track that the student is becoming increasingly competent across these areas, but it's driven by and it prioritizes agency, reflection, and sort of building the student's capacity as a learner.
Yeah, something that I heard in both of what you said. You said the word specifically, Jeff, but it's definitely underlying what you shared, Nerel, is this idea of how important reorienting the system to be a place that trusts learners, to know who they are and what they need and what they want, is one of those sort of fundamental shifts of moving from schooling to learning. Involves the sort of being in a place of trust, and not only in that space, not only do we need to reorient around trusting learners and knowing that that we're helping them understand who they are and knowing what they need, but that also means that we have to trust educators in a different way. We can't have a system that sponsors agency and learners and have a compliance-oriented culture for adults. So I would love to hear a little bit. We've talked about different elements of the system and sort of what learners are doing and what those outcomes are. I'm curious, as we think about what's been the impact on educators in your spaces as you implement these practices and over time. Nerel, I'd love to hear you.
We've had we were lucky enough to be able to create a high school. Middle school, we were able to take an existing world and start shifting it. Elementary, we started playing with something that was existing and shifting it. And the reality is, it's a whole lot easier to redesign and to play with competencies in elementary than it is in high school. And I'll just give you an example, right? For those of you who have kids, if you have your child in kinder, your expectation of that kinder teacher is that they better know every little bit detail about your baby or else, right? And so it's an expectation. And the reality is the kinder teacher is the embodiment of another parent and somebody who's building relationships with them. For some reason, as they go into high school, we have what are called in California single subject credentials. And we have this thought process that my role in high school is to teach a specific subject area. And so I'm a math teacher. I'm here to teach math. And my job is to support kids in getting from one standard to the next. And that is it. And so a lot of it is a redesign of mindset and then this mindset shift around unlearning what is the role of a teacher. A lot of our work has been with credentialing programs around you guys are teaching the wrong stuff. You're stuck in theory and you're not looking at the actual child and knowing who the human is and really being able to understand how do you build relationships with kids that many times have really, really difficult lives. And so as you start bridging this into competency-based metrics, then you also start to play with some really deep-rooted emotions that surround teachers. And those include things like, I control my grade, I control the class output. I control what's going on in terms of the lessons and all these sort of things, rather than thinking about, well, what does it look like to start shifting the mindset around the student is actually at the center of that. The student is the one who's dictating where learning needs to go. The student is the one who's driving the learning experiences and supporting them through that. And so what the shift is with educators is a shift from the idea that I'm here to teach students, and rather that I'm here to be a part of their learning journey. And that learning journey can take many different types of roads and maps, and it's crazy and convoluted, but ultimately we're all here to support the same purpose, which is we're here for students and knowing them really well. And so ultimately, it is really difficult to change mindset. Educators, as we all know, tend to be both extremely passionate individuals and can be very fixed mindset individuals. And so it's a lot of how do we start playing with where is it we want to go, how to help students there, and what does that look like? And my argument is that fixed mindset is not because people are born that way and that comes from just what we do. It's because we all have the PTSD of having gone through traditional schooling systems where the only way we've been successful is by being successful at fixed mindset systems, right? And so a lot of it is helping people realize that actually there are other opportunities, there are other options available, and it just needs a large number of us to gather together and a shift mindset around where things can go. And so it is very exciting. And I think to Jeff's point is, if you are thinking about doing this, don't do it alone. Find a partner to do it with. We were lucky enough to partner with some brilliant, brilliant minds. I'll share another one. One Stone out in Boise, Idaho. Chad Carlson out there is brilliant at creating systems like this. And so it is a network of us that play with how do you do learning and how do you do one in a way that really is supporting our kids.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, that unlearning piece, and truly like this idea of like, is this what you would build? Is this what you even want for yourself? Like as an educator, do you know what I mean? Is this what even feels good? And like unpacking your own like assumptions and experiences of learning and like what would have actually been more empowering for you as a learner. Jeff, same question about adults. Like what's the impact you've had on educators, or that you've seen the transition to competency have on educators?
I think the one that first comes to mind for me is just wellness. Especially recently after the pandemic, I feel like most educators I know are working at or beyond capacity all the time. And so one of the things that's been really moving to me is working with some schools around this idea of retooling around students as the individual humans they are and their interests. And it really can, I think, reconnect educators with why they got interested in this work in the first place, which can be pretty healing. I think the PTSD of traditional school impacts adults really intensely as well as kids. Some of the ways I think about that are you take an adult who's naturally inclined to want to get to know this kid and support their needs and support their interests, and you move such a volume of those students in front of them week to week that it's just physically impossible to do that. And so you're kind of presenting someone with a very human, healthy urge that they have and that drives why they got into a profession. And you're saying, no, you can't, which I think has really damaging emotional impacts over time. That's probably a different podcast. So I think the wellness is a big one. I also think just a huge change in mindset. And in my experience, and this applies to me too, it's like, how much can I keep forgetting what I know as a trained educator and just be in my person as an adult? Like, one of the ways that I describe this is if you had a young person in your life of the age range that you're designing school around, but in your life away from school, come to you and venture to share an interest or something that they thought they wanted to learn about or something that they just saw that excited them. I think the last thing you would do is like, go off by yourself and map out a curriculum and start thinking about assessments. You would just use your resourceful adult heart and head and say, well, let's talk about that. And I know someone who knows something about that. Or have you thought about this? You wouldn't be overly pushy. You would be offering suggestions because you want them to keep driving this. So a lot of the time I'm just thinking like, okay, how are we acting like that in our design of school, and how are we falling off the rails into spaces like, I mean, I think the rails that we fall off are just an obsession with accountability.
Yes.
So if my niece said, I read this great story last week, I would not say, what's your evidence?
Right. Yeah.
So to me, the accountability piece, if there's one most significant mindset or hurdle that we have to let go of around this shift to trusting students, it's realize that in our day-to-day interactions, we don't wield accountability in the ways that we do in schools. I think that can be another helpful one.
Yeah.
And I think just to add to that, Jeff, because that's the struggle point always. And I think that's driven in two directions. Actually, there's like many different directions that emotion comes from. And I was just seeing whoever wrote about the TK8 and then high schools in the area not following along, and then all of the stress from parents. All of that comes together, right? And I think if you're talking about the educator mindset, it's extremely difficult to do. And I would say take out the word competency-based learning, like let's not use that word, and instead say like strong learning is hard to do. Like strong teaching learning environments, that's really difficult. Like if you're sending kids off to school and say they're just going to just do their own thing all day, that's not what competency-based learning is talking about. It's like designing out really strong learning environments that revolve around who our students are and allow them to pitch and move that learning into the next direction. So I hear a lot this idea that competency-based learning is just fluffy, right? It's not real, and there needs to be strong accountability to really ensure that it's going to be supporting students. That's a hurdle we have to overcome.
Yeah.
One of the this might be helpful for people trying to do this. One of the things that was helpful for that rigor piece is inviting community members into exhibitions. And some community members, like for us early on, it was school board members. And we were definitely trying to convince them that what we were doing was, at least as rigorous as the old system. And when they sit through an hour-long post-presentation discussion with parents, multiple staff, a bunch of kids, I think most people say, like, man, that was really intense. And this happens like how many times a year? And every year? And then another example, adults that I know in big picture schools are frequently talking about, well, we should do exhibitions. Like, wouldn't that be cool? And I've known very few who've pulled it off in terms of the scheduling, but the two adult exhibitions I've been to, after extensive preparation, both of the adults mismanaged time, were visibly like terribly nervous. Exhibition didn't really go the way they had wanted. And so it was another kind of wake up call that like, man, this thing we're asking kids to do is heavy lifting, and much more rigorous than, a lot of more traditional forms of assessment.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's resonating with me and what you both just said is around like how educators, adults in the system need to basically like show up as learners and be okay with, rather than being teachers who have the single subject knowledge of their content, but like we're all just learners in the system. And like if we acknowledge that, like we don't have the answers to all these questions, and those are the questions that are worth asking. Like if I already know the answer, then that is not a question worth asking of my learners. There are bigger questions in the world to solve, and way more interesting. And there's that connection. There's a connection to like, and what comes next. If we're looking at real questions in the world and giving learners the opportunity to answer, then like the narrow focus of like sort of career readiness is like, that is just the learning that we do, is like, it's all about exploring all the possibilities and questions of the world. This is really great. I want to transition and see if we have a few minutes to take some questions from the audience. And I want to highlight this one too. I'm gonna read it. I really like this one. How have you both gone about shifting mindsets among students, families, educators about the purpose of education and the definition of student success, the roles of individuals in and out of the formalized system, and what role did storytelling play in that? And I don't know, Jeff, you're off mute. Do you want to jump in with that?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, in terms about the definitions, students, family, purpose, in terms of the purpose of education, an activity that I've used sometimes frequently is just ask folks to, um, you know, if kids could get anything, any one thing out of the time they spend in school with us, like what would that be? And name, like 5 things, and then get rid of 3 of them, and then partner up with someone, and you share your 2 and they share their 2, and like sort of push a group to really come together. And then that almost always in very different settings, that leads to a few things like a strong sense of themselves, a sense of purpose, a sense of agency, like ability to kind of drive their own path. Um, and so that can be illuminating of like, oh, well, if that's the case, like, how come our school is designed around all this other stuff? Um, and I mean, I do think storytelling, Elliot Washer, I remember pointing out that folks are obsessed with data, but if you listen to, keynotes or people talk about the work, it almost always comes down to stories. So I know those 2 things serve very different functions. I think also asking adults to remember their most meaningful learning experiences and unpack those, tell the story of that, and to what extent did it happen, in a traditional classroom?
Yeah.
Usually not.
Yeah.
Just
I love
ideas.
all 3 of those examples. I think are super powerful ways, Nerel, but I'd love to hear from you.
I think there is a tremendous amount of motion that revolves around how shifting from what we feel comfortable with to shifting to something different and something that is unique. And I think the emotion revolves around, will my kid be successful? Will they end up in Harvard? Will they be okay? Like these types of emotions, right? And everybody has them. But if you really dive into it and really start working through with parents, what is it ultimately that they want for their students? Like words like happiness, like well-being, like feeling like loved and cared for, like these tend to be the bottom line points that parents are ultimately wanting. And so we spend a lot of time with parents, and this idea of storytelling is crucial to how we approach this idea of shifting the competency-based world. Is we have to tell a story from the student's point of view. We have to tell the story from like what is it ultimately that's going to drive them to where they need to go and to support them in that context. And we also have to tell the story that they're going to be fine in terms of the endpoint, right? And I think that's part of this, is that you as the administrator or the leader of the system, you're also playing a counselor and psychologist and relationship builder with families that have had to deal with tons of stress and anxiety around what happens with my kid after high school. And I think that the example to think about, like, go back to your high school experience, right? You typically will have in a big comprehensive high school 8 counselors, and all of us had high school experiences. We all have the K through 12 in common. In my high school experience, I met with my high school counselor once. And when I talk with schools across the nation, typically the answer is they meet with a high school counselor 0 or 1 time. And that person is the only person whose job is to support students in terms of who they want to be. And then we ask ourselves, why are so many students dropping out? Why is there so much stress around the system? Why are kids not ending up where they need to be? And the reality is we just built a system that doesn't know kids very well. And so I think ultimately having that narrative about school is about knowing kids. It's about loving them. It's about knowing where they want to go and creating a network for them and getting there. That's a story that sells pretty well. And we found a lot of success in that.
Yeah, if they know who they are, if they have a sense of who they are as a person, and they have a sense of agency in themselves and in their lives, and we've taught them how to be a learner, that what more is there? What more is there to prepare learners for whatever comes next? That they can advocate for themselves, they know who they are, and they know how to learn whatever it is they need to learn next. Yeah,
I would throw out, just related to this, because some folks are also asking, like, how do you get people on board with that this is viable for kids, accessing college and so on. And I think when people asking those questions are around students who are really thriving and driving their own learning, it's very clear to them that these students are going places. So one of the tips we got from the MET, the first big picture school, was convening a gathering of admissions directors from all the four-year colleges and universities in the state to come to the school, and we started with a student panel. So I think if we had told those people, hey, look, the kids are doing amazing work, they would have been like, yeah, sure, where's the transcript? They met the kids, and you could even see them kind of sidling up to some of these kids like, oh, what are you thinking for a year after next? And then we said, okay, we're not doing, well, we did a question around, apart from what your website says, what are the core attributes by which kids succeed in your college? And then we condense those. And then also on the flip side, if kids don't make it at your school, why not? And then we condensed those, and we said, okay, this is how we're trying to design school. Help us talk to you. And they were really cooperative in co-designing a gradeless, creditless transcript with us. But it started with putting them in a room with kids. And I think if we had not done that, they wouldn't have believed us that
our process was very similar as well. And a lot of it is, I mean, think about it this way, right? Most universities are businesses, right? And they acquire lots of their students from outside of their state. And transcripts from different states don't look the same. And even more than that, I guarantee you that transcripts that are coming from nations outside of our nation do not look like our transcript. And yet those students still get in. And so the question then becomes, well, we've got kids in your backyard. What's going on here? How can we help you understand that you've got brilliant minds that are right here, who we can show in many different ways how smart they are and how capable they are of being successful with you? And so it's really conversations that are being held with all of these universities around ultimately what is it that you're requiring and needing for students to be successful, and we've got the perfect candidate for you, right? And it's shifting that mindset.
Yeah, I love that. And I just we have just a minute left. So I want to say, I wanted to close with this question, but I'm going to like put words in your mouths basically around like, so it's challenging, but it's possible. And how do we get started? And I think my takeaway from what we just shared is around conversations with people, and putting learners in front of people to show what it is they're capable of, and that is that it speaks for itself in terms of the power of what competency-based learning what students can do in that environment. So I just want to say, if you have more questions for the panelists, Ashley dropped in the chat an email to send to, and we'll pull the chat thread and make sure we connect with the questions that we didn't get to answer. But if you have more, feel free to put them in collaborate@learnercentered.org. I want to give a huge thanks to Nerel and Jeff for taking the time to chat with us today. I really appreciated the conversation and your perspective. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and experience with us. It was really wonderful to have you. Yeah, and again, more questions, feel free to reach out. Our next webinar is October 22nd at noon. The topic is creating coherence and aligning systems towards a learner-centered vision. And so we'd love to have you join us for that conversation as well, to continue moving this learner-centered work forward. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you again, Nerel and Jeff. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
As well.
Thank you.